Brian Spear, CEO of Techno Silva. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, of course. So we are right in the heart of wildfire season. So I think it's a very appropriate time to be having this conversation with you. You know, while we're talking, much of the West is facing some pretty devastating impacts from wildfires, and we know that that's especially of interest to utilities. Recent years, you know, PG&E, Hawaiian Electric, Xcel have all dealt with sparks caused by their infrastructure in one way or the other. And in a lot of the conversations I've had with those utilities out west, they rank wildfires number one above all other issues. PG&E being one of the largest utilities in the country and the world. One of their senior leaders told me a couple of months ago that, you know, all those other issues that we talk about with the energy transition or interconnection, clean energy, batteries, all that stuff takes a back seat to wildfires and wildfire mitigation. So really looking forward to diving into all of that with you and how AI fits into this without just being some additional fluff that we hear with AI. So before we get there, tell me a little bit about yourself and some of the work you guys are doing at Techno Silva.
Yeah, so John, I've been with Techno Silva for almost 2 years now, and we've been around for a long time. We've been around since 1997. And initially we were focused on agencies, and we work with about 10 agencies. We work with agencies across about 10 countries, with some of the largest in the world. In the U.S., we work with, Cal Fire, with the authoritative modeling platform for all of California. We work for the Forest Service across multiple states, Missoula Fire Lab. We just started a big deployment across British Columbia. So that's how the business got started. But you mentioned some of the utility caused ignitions and some of the implications of that. And that's what we realized in about 2015. Our founder started, working with San Diego Gas and Electric. They had the witch fires, years before that. And we realized that we've got this very unique technology that can model and predict fires. And we can take that from the use cases of the agencies, and we can turn that into something that's very predictive for utilities and help utilities understand where they're at risk for igniting fires and help them prevent them from happening. And so that's what we did in 2015. We worked with San Diego Gas and Electric to tailor the product around those use cases. And then later in 2019, I think Southern Cal Edison adopted the tools, and then PG&E shortly thereafter. But during that time, it was still seen as a California issue. And then in 2019, I believe it was the Labor Day fires, and then 2020, I might be off a year on that, were the Marshall fires. And then the industry started to wake up and say, hey, this is more than California, but still, it was a Western thing at that time, right? It was a Western problem, and you had it was California that had inverse condemnation, so no other states did. So it was thought to be that it just wasn't the same type of order of magnitude. But then it's funny, we're talking here on August 8th. A year ago today is when Lahaina happened, when the fires tore through Lahaina, right? The most deadly fires in over a century in the U.S. And Hawaii Electric, lost 75% of their market cap overnight. That was an area that most did not expect was really that burnable. It wasn't seen as being high risk. It was destructive. It was terrible. Whether the utility was responsible or not, it didn't matter because it was being pinned on them. Their market cap took a hit. You've seen recently they just settled, did not admit guilt, but they settled for almost $2 billion. Huge impact on the company. And that's when all utilities across the country started to say, we've got a problem. We've got a wildfire problem. That problem might be that we actually are at risk of igniting fires, or it might be that we just need to be able to articulate that risk or the lack thereof to our investors, to the insurance community, et cetera, because you got a lot of utilities now that they can't get insurance or they're self-insuring, right? And then you probably remember Warren Buffett came out and talked about how the investment viability of utilities was in question, the uncapped liability, and the wildfire risk just wasn't sustainable. 2 days after that was when the Smokehouse Creek fires broke out. That was targeted on the utilities as well. So I say all that because it's really changed. Where our market for utilities was really on the West Coast, and now it's the whole country scrambling because they've got to get something in place. They've got to be prepared so that number one, they understand their risk, and number two, they've got tools in place to be able to prevent a catastrophic fire from happening off of their assets. And It used to be just the California utilities that said this is our number one risk. Now it's many utilities, even across the East Coast, that this is their number one or number two corporate risk. Because if you think about it, it's one of the very few things that can bankrupt a utility in very short order.
Yeah, and it did to PG&E. It almost got Hawaiian Electric, like skin of their teeth. They're still here. Before getting into those tools, because I don't want to fragment the conversation too much, but can you say where you're getting that interest outside of the West, or maybe even regionally? Because I think that's really interesting. PG&E CEO Patty Poppe on their earnings call a week ago. I mean, how much of that you probably listened to it, given that you're so closely aligned with them? How much of it concerned wildfires? It was like 75% of that earnings call, even from the investor class, are asking about this. What are you doing? Who are you talking to? What are the software tools that you guys are incorporating? And one of the things she pointed out was that, talked about Cal Fire and some of the programs that California has stood up to support utilities who can no longer get insurance. And she was speaking to this need for a national framework or national program to address wildfires and wildfire mitigation. But her comment was that utilities outside of the West still don't seem that interested, or they're not at the point where they face so much risk that they're willing to contribute to some kind of a national fund or national standards. And you're suggesting that that's starting to change a bit. So I'm wondering where that's coming from.
It's starting to change, and I'll answer a lot of that, but let me give you one example. I talked to a utility on the East Coast, very large utility, talked to the president in February, and they said, Brian, we will never proactively turn off power. Never. It goes against everything that we've been working towards over the past couple of decades. We'll never do that. We don't have wildfire risk. We don't have high level of risk in our territory. Not a big priority for us. Ran into him at EEI just recently. It's our number one or number two top priority, right? And that's a matter of just a few short months. So what we've seen, we're now across. Much of this has been over the past 18 months, but we're now across 17 different utilities, 15 states. We've got another 9 states in the South and Southeast that we're engaged with on doing a risk assessment to understand what their level of risk is before they do dynamic analysis. So first step, in many cases, a lot of cases, you have risk. There's no need in doing a risk assessment at that point. You need to dynamically monitor your risk so that you can act on it and see it coming. But some states are still trying to figure out, they're trying to justify their investment. In the West, there's no need for that. They all know they have risk. They're going directly into the dynamic modeling. But we're seeing more in the East and Southeast. They're starting with the risk assessment, understand what that risk is. So we've also gone like upper Midwest and in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We're deploying full solutions there, not risk assessments, but full solutions. And then, we expect to be doing that very shortly in some of the Southeast as well.
So frame for me how utilities generally approach wildfire mitigation, from forecasting to their own, internal strategies, and where you fit in then into that puzzle.
Yeah, so it varies, right? You've got the California utilities who have known for a long time they had a problem. They have really large teams, and they have multifaceted approaches, and we play a very core and critical role into what they do. But when you move further east and you have less, I don't want to say less sophistication, but less experience with the problem, we've had to modify our tools to be able to I guess, simplify the output so that we can help utilities. In the West, you could say, hey, you could give them the data, they could turn that into decisions. Right now, we have to turn the data into decisions for these utilities. But just to tell you what they use our tools for. So first off, if I summarize what we do for utilities, it's helping them prevent asset caused ignitions and doing it in the most economically efficient way. Right. So what that means, what we're able to do is we're able to take all the utilities, all their assets, right? We're looking at asset caused ignitions, and we're looking at not only if an asset would start a fire, but what would the consequences be if it did start a fire? each individual asset, number of structures that would be destroyed, number of people impacted, critical facilities in the way, egress in the area, right? All those types of things. And we're able to look on an individual asset by asset basis. What's the probability under certain conditions, certain weather conditions, and that means wind, humidity, fuel moisture, those types of things. What's the probability of ignition, and then what are the consequences of ignition? And then that helps them prioritize where to focus. And if you think about it operationally, what are they using this for? They're looking in advance and trying to predict when they've got extreme weather events that are coming, maximum wind gusts that we're forecasting. We're looking 5 to 7 days out. We're taking weather. We're taking fuel types. So what types of fuels are in that territory? What's the moisture level of those fuels? And we're using AI, machine learning, to have those dynamically updated. So if you don't have real-time data on fuel moisture, then how do you properly model fire spread and ignition potential, right? So that's partly where we use AI and machine learning, is to dynamically update those models, help them see in advance 5 to 7 days of where they have high risk areas based on weather scenarios, and then they can start to position crews. They can start to notify customers. They can notify the fire agencies, the local fire agencies, and they can be prepared. And then worst case scenario, they have to do, change system settings, enhance system settings, or they have to do PSPS, right? In those instances, you need to be really, really surgical. You need to know that if you're going to enact one of those events, that it's absolutely necessary, that you are doing it to avoid a catastrophic fire, and you're doing it you're limiting the scope and duration of it as much as possible. And that's what we're able to do. Anybody could just go do power shutoff and do it anytime that there was a red flag, a warning coming from NOAA or something like that, right? Off a big section of their territory. But it's not feasible. It's expensive. It's dangerous, because these events can be dangerous to customers, and it would destroy customer satisfaction, right? So what we're able to do is help them be very, very surgical about it. Give you an example. Southern Cal Edison mentioned in their sustainability report that they've been able to reduce their outage time from public safety power shutoff events by 92% over the last 3 years, and that's by using data such as this and using tools such as this. And then the second piece, so you've got the operational when you're using it to direct power shutoff events or for enhanced settings, and then the second piece of it is planning. So if you can understand at the asset level where you have the highest levels of risk of ignition potential and consequence, then you can be really smart about directing vegetation management priorities. Vegetation management is the number one operational expense for most utilities, right? So if you can be smarter about that, it's a pretty big payback. If you can be smart about where you're going to underground, I know some utilities are doing some undergrounding. In some cases it's necessary, but that needs to be very minimal because it's extremely expensive. And then things like covered conductor and other asset upgrades. With these tools, you can understand, you can easily calculate how to buy down that risk, what the risk return on that investment is going to be by making those different decisions.
That was all great. And I can already tell that I'm probably going to take more than the 20 minutes that I requested for this interview. All right. I want to unpack several pieces of that. So one, and you can take them in order if you want to, how do you analyze specifically the ignition risk of each asset? How do you get those data points? And on the undergrounding vegetation management, I'm really curious about, does your software spit out a report and say, by the way, based on your system, we think that you need to cut trees here. You should probably bury these lines due to the age of the existing infrastructure and the risks. And then I want to get back into the public safety, the power shutoffs and how that chain of command gets triggered. So I guess I'm basically asking you to restate everything that you just presented, but with even a layer deeper. But can we start off with that ignition risk? What goes into getting that data?
Absolutely, it's a good question. I'm glad you want to go deeper on this. So let me start by maybe sharing everything that's involved in the models in our analysis. So we have the key input into fire modeling, obviously, is weather, right? So we use very advanced commercial grade weather that has to be very granular. So if you use publicly available weather, it's not granular. It's like 4 square kilometers, right? And it only goes out like 36 hours with any level of integrity. And we're able to take that and break it down into 1 to 2 kilometer squares. We can even do high resolution wind down to like 250 meters, right? And then we can go out 5 to 7 days in advance. So that's the weather is a really, really key input to this. And then we are gathering things like the surface fuels, the canopy fuels, the fuel moisture levels of both dead and live fuels. And again, that's being done dynamically. We take that with some static data, so things like the population, the buildings, the critical infrastructure, the terrain. We take all of the utility asset data, so every asset on their system. We look at we look backwards over the past, as long as we have data for. We try to go back 30 years, and we take that reanalyzed weather data. We correlate that to outage data on a granular basis, so we can see, like, under certain types of scenarios of wind, humidity, et cetera, on a circuit by circuit basis, when have you had outages? Often vegetation related, right? And that'll tell you when you have a probability of an outage or probability of ignition. So that's kind of how you get, and obviously the ignition potential plays into all those other factors of the environmental conditions and everything else as well. So that gives us the probability of failure, probability of ignition. And then we're running simulations, millions of simulations every day from each asset out. So I'll give you just an order of magnitude. In California alone, we run 500 million simulations every single day. So we're running them every hour. We're taking into account the probability of ignition, but also fire spread modeling. So that's our core. That's what we started with, right? We started with fire spread modeling, and that gives us the consequences of that ignition. So you know your probability of ignition, you know how it's going to spread. So that tells you exactly what the consequences would be. How many acres would be burned? How many people would be impacted? How many buildings would be destroyed? And then you have the ability to tie that back to an individual asset. Okay. We're doing that every hour, 5 to 7 days in advance. And this is like, if you go into a utilities emergency operating center, this is what's up on their screen every single day. So your other question was, how do you turn that into, like, are we going to underground or not? It's not as simple as spitting an output that says you need to underground here or not underground there.
Get an email in the morning that says,
yeah, right.
Hey, Patty, I've got 10,000 miles of line here for you. It's going to cost you $200 million.
That's right. But it really gives you all the information that you need to make those decisions.
Okay. Very interesting. And you were talking a bit about the AI applications here. You know, I think the challenge, the growing number of solution providers, software developers that are flooding into this space is reflective of the challenge that you were trying to address. Mm-hmm. What would you say differentiates what Techno Silva is doing, and maybe why so many others are kind of popping up? It seems to be getting some VC interest for a couple of different firms. And maybe that'll give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the business case and how you position, whether as a solution in isolation or pairing up with insurance companies or risk management folks, like wherever that goes.
Good question. So the reason that companies are flocking to this right now is because they see the opportunity. You know, it wasn't that way a year ago. Before Lahaina, it was seen we talked about it, as a California problem. That's a very limited market from a wildfire perspective. But that's changed, and now people see that this is a broader problem across almost all utilities. They want to get in and help solve the problem, and that's great. I mean, the more people that can get in and bring innovative solutions, then the better. I think what has put us in a unique position is that we've been doing this for so long. We got 27 years of this, right? And here's what's important. It's not just we've got really unique solutions for utilities, but the solutions for utilities are so rich because of our solutions for the fire agencies, because they're using these models on the ground every single day. So our fire models are validated in a way that no other models are validated. And that matters because, like, I believe that overestimating fire spread is almost as bad as underestimating. Because if you're overestimating it, then you're taking precautions that you shouldn't be taking, and it's costing money. It's disrupting people. You're not making educated decisions. So we need to be able to accurately predict fire spread. And so we've got the models, thousands of fires every year that these are being validated on. The data is going real time back into our system. So you've got firefighters out in the field on their mobile, they're tracking spread. That gets correlated to how our models were predicting that they would spread, and we're constantly training them. That's where the machine learning comes in, right? That's something that can't be easily replicated with AI only, right? Fire modeling is extremely, extremely complex. So many different inputs into it, far more complex than weather modeling alone. And weather modeling is complex as well. So that's where I think, and then also, like, from a utility perspective, yes, it's great to have an understanding of where you might have fires, and that's helpful to some utilities that are just getting started. But what they really care about is which of their assets are likely to start fires, under which conditions, and how do they act to prevent that. And if you can act to prevent a fire, and you're using a software solution to help you do that, it's a pretty rich payback. If you're using a software solution to help you prioritize your vegetation management, that's a pretty rich payback. If you're using that to determine where you're going to upgrade assets, it's an incredible return on investment. And you're seeing in a lot of places, specifically in California, where there's a lot of pressure on rates. And that's not necessarily because of wildfire mitigation. That has a role in it. There's been a lot of investment on the renewable side, et cetera, in California. A lot of complexities there. But when you look at how do they get more efficient, how do they bring rates down, you can't quit focusing on wildfire. But if you can continue using those tools to be smarter about where you invest, then that can have a big impact ultimately on rates as well.
Is that your way in with the other utilities as well, that maybe don't see the risk as being as significant as it is in California, that then you go to those Northeast utilities and say, hey, I know you're just dipping your toe in the wildfire mitigation stuff, but start out with vegetation management and system planning and upgrades and that kind of stuff, and then scale the solution based on how your risk evolves, and then you can get closer to that enterprise suite.
So there are a couple things going on there, John, that would be helpful context. So after Lahaina, and again, this doesn't say that the utility had anything to do with this, but after that, everyone started to recognize that having a plan for public safety power shutoff, PSPS, is imperative. And now it's become widely accepted across the industry that PSPS is the standard of care, meaning that if you don't do PSPS and you have a catastrophic wildfire, then you're probably going to be found negligent, and then you're going to have uncapped liabilities. This has become very widely accepted across the industry. Even I was speaking with a senator here a couple weeks ago. They even made that statement to me. They said PSPS has become the standard of care. I was really surprised to hear that at that level. I thought it was only kind of an industry thing, right? So that's become widely known. So that's really how utilities are starting now, is they know that they have to have a plan in place, that if something were to happen, that they have the ability to enact that, because that's not something you can just do. You've got to put sectionalizers in place. There's some hardware, pieces of that solution also you need to do to be surgical about it. And plus, you've got to have a communications plan. You've got to understand where your customers are that are on medical devices, et cetera, where your critical facilities are. There's a lot of planning that has to go into that, in addition to what we do, which is helping you be very surgical and do that in advance so that you can do it in a safe and efficient manner.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up too. And you've mentioned the word surgical a couple of times, which I think is a great way of describing it. I can't quite remember if it was Rocky Mountain Power in Utah or Xcel in Colorado. I think it was Xcel in Colorado that has faced its issues with ignition, not specifically in Colorado, but very recently in Texas. I believe that the governor was kind of clapping back at them for initiating a public safety power shutoff that lasted a few days. We know it takes time to re-energize that line and get customers back in business, but they faced quite a bit of reprimand. Press releases, interviews with local media. Xcel must be held accountable for doing this. That is one of your customers, so I'm interested. Like, how do you work on that with them? And I imagine that decision ultimately is scrutinized internally as well quite a bit before it goes live.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Glad you brought it up. So yeah, this was Xcel in Colorado. They had very significant extreme event, very
Wind,
high,
right?
very high winds, very high winds. If I remember correctly, I want to say it was up around 90 miles an hour. I might be off.
I think so.
Very significant. It was their first PSPS event that they had done. I think every utility, if you look at every utility that's done it, the first one is always difficult. You always get scrutinized for it. You always realize that you could have done a better job in communicating to customers and preparing them. And I think Xcel has acknowledged that as well. It's complex and nobody likes them. However, if you look at what they avoided, the potential impacts that they avoided, so they were actually on the news showing our tools. Like you run simulations after an event like that because they have to report to the regulator. They have to show what they did, the impact, and what they
and the investment. Did the investment pay off? Right.
Exactly. And they were able to run simulations, so they were able to show how many potential homes could have been destroyed had they not done that. Because they then go survey the lines, and you survey the lines, and you've got poles that are down, you've got trees into lines, etc. We were tracking all the conditions, all the wind and weather conditions. So they're able to then do simulations and then quantify the impact of what was avoided or could have been potentially avoided had they not made those decisions. So look, I say kudos to Xcel for making that tough decision. If they hadn't, then we'd have to be having a much different conversation here potentially. And I think they've learned a lot from it, from how to communicate with customers ahead of time and ensure that it's maybe accepted a little bit better next time.
Well, Brian Spear, I think this is incredibly important, but it's also really interesting just in all the different, layers that go into crafting a sound wildfire mitigation program and the software and all that. So thanks for taking the time to chat with me. I really enjoyed it.
John, thank you. Pleasure's mine.